I've had a few people suggest to me that I should do a best of, my favorite albums of all time, whether that's 25 or 50 or 100. I've seen some people in the VC actually do these marathon, my best 200 albums of all time. Now that is a huge undertaking, and I don't think I will be doing that. But I'm gonna release occasionally some new episodes that I'm going to call a new series. And I came up with a good title. I think that kind of dovetails quite well with the name of my channel. I'm going to call this Best in Class, the Iconic Albums. And I've decided to start with the 1966 Bob Dylan double album masterpiece, Blonde on Blonde, because about a week ago, as you do, I was out checking out a couple record shops on a Saturday afternoon. I actually think I was supposed to be grocery shopping that afternoon, but I had put that off for later. Anyway, popped into one of my favorite shops and found an original 66 early pressing, mono pressing of Blonde on Blonde. This had the Claudia interior photos, which were not in print for very long. Dylan's agents decided that that was probably not a good idea, so they dropped that one beautiful photograph of the actress Claudia Cardinal. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I'm gonna show you guys that album. But that is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to kick off a brand new series. It's going to be called Best in Class, the Iconic Albums. Today, I want to talk about my personal history with Blonde on Blonde. And we're going to take a look at a couple different pressings of it, along with a different format as well. And kick this series off in great fashion. Some of my earliest musical memories are centered around my parents. They had a stereo, different components. I think they may have had Advent speakers. They had a modest record collection, but I can remember as a little boy, kind of looking through those records, figuring out how to play records on a turntable, and I distinctly remember Bob Dylan's greatest hits and Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. I don't remember seeing Blonde on Blonde. So Blonde on Blonde, I think I first started getting into Dylan. Um, it must have been, first for me was of course the Beatles, like so many other people. I was gifted a turntable one Christmas. I know I bought Sergeant Pepper's and other things, but eventually, I guess maybe late middle school or maybe it was my freshman year in high school, started to kind of dig into Bob Dylan. And I remember that I had Blonde on Blonde on one of those kind of, I think it was a special price, two record cassette tape. So I definitely remember having that. I had my freshman year in high school. I had been given a room in the basement of our house, and I had set up a stereo system in there, and all this crappy silver faced late 70s into early 80s gear. But I specifically remember getting a cassette copy of Blonde on Blonde. Fast forward to 2003, I was working in Europe, and the news had come out that they were remastering the entire, or most of the Dylan catalog, the great albums at least. They were going to be coming out on Super Audio, Compact Disc, SACD, and the SACDs, of course, had a layer for CD as well, so they were compatible with CD players. And this was the box set that was originally released. I think this came out in 2003. All of the great albums are in here. And I've already taken out Blonde on Blonde. Let me put this down. Really nice repackaged album, double album. Replicates the interior artwork. And this, of course, was the latter edition of photographs. They had to remove the Claudia Cardinal photo, and they call it the Whisperer photo, where you've got a girl whispering into Bob's ear, I think. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But man, in 2003, I was so happy to have this box set. I thought nothing had sounded better. Vinyl was a distant memory. And then in 2013, I think it was 2013, Mobile Fidelity put out the original master recording on 345 RPM LPs, 180 gram of the masterpiece. There it is. Now, this was taken from a 1999 remix, and it's a stereo mix, and this thing sounds absolutely incredible. It is very, very, very detailed, great separation of instruments. So much clarity now is available to the listener. Remember, though, the album was originally released in mono. And back in the mid 1960s, mono still was king. And there's something to be said for that original mono mix. First of all, if you do any research, Bob Dylan was directly involved in the mixing of the mono mix, and he and others took about 4 days to get that original mono mix completed. And I think they were working on that mono mix in Los Angeles. Robbie Robertson was there as well, helping out. And I think Dylan had to go. He had some kind of an engagement. He had to leave. And what happened next was, of course, obligatory, they had to release a stereo mix. Now, legend has it, and research proves, if you dig around on the internet, that compared to 4 days of intense attention to the mono mix with the artist involved, the stereo mix, the original stereo mix, was done in 4 hours. So that kind of tells you something about, how important the mono mix was at the time in the mid 1960s. Of course, we can point to the Beatles as well, and all of those early albums, the mono mix is really king. And, now, though, that we have a really nice mix in stereo, it's kind of interesting to kind of compare and contrast. And this is not a shootout video, so I'm not going to be here to say definitively, well, this is the ultimate listening experience, and you must go get, the MoFi box. Regardless of how MoFi came up with this product, we know that there now was a digital step, and it was a DSD 64, which is interesting. There's much better quality DSD transfers for some of the other albums, but that may have something to do with the quality of the source material that they worked with, which was that 99 remix, done by somebody by the name of, I think his name was Michael Brower. Anyway, and that may have been done in part looking towards those SACD releases that came in the early 2000s. As I mentioned in the intro, though, about a week ago, I managed to find a very, very early mono pressing of this album. And this is a pretty cool document. You can see that the sleeve is definitely not in pristine condition, but I just love the patina. I love the ring wear. It makes you wonder, how many people had this album. But the cool thing about this album is, well, there's a couple cool things. First of all, it was an early run, and you can see there's Claudia Cardinal there in that panel, and that photo and others were eventually removed and replaced with different photos of Bob. So that's one indication that this was a very early pressing. The other indication is the two LPs were in their original kind of poly plastic bags, and you can still see at the top that this was sealed originally, and there's there's perforations here where you could have the person opened the record. But very, very cool the way they constructed the actual covers. Is there is a couple different glue spots, and a traditional four corner interior inner sleeve would not fit in the album, so they had to have this rounded off poly bag. So this is pretty incredible. I mean, these things are actually still serviceable, although they are kind of probably degrading. I'm going to be putting these in some archival sleeves shortly, but just for the video, I wanted to show that that's what those original bags looked like. The astonishing thing about this album that I found is the condition that I found this in. So this thing is absolutely full gloss. It plays with no noise. There are no spindle wear marks around that spindle hole. It's a gorgeous original 2i Columbia with the very cool, non-breakable, which is under the catalog number. We've got the dual little logos on either side, and that large mono on the very bottom, 360 sound. This thing just sounds absolutely incredible. Now, one of the arguments that you can make toward the MoFi is, of course, the vinyl compound that MoFi uses and really touts, and for good reason. It's basically a silent it's a silent medium. When you put on a MoFi album, other than maybe some static issues, in the very beginning, you might have to do some cleaning, some brushing, but that is typically a silent. There's no noise floor there, so you're playing a pristine copy of an album and not having to worry about surface noise. That was the shocking thing to me with this album. There is no surface noise as well, so I'm able to kind of compare and contrast a little bit. So as I stated earlier, in the mid 60s, mono was the preferred medium, and it's something that the artist paid most attention to as far as getting things right. And these Columbia Dylan monos, the OGs, they all kind of share something that's really kind of unique and interesting, and that is they all have quite a bit of punch, quite a bit of drive. Someone described these monos as having kind of a nervous energy to them, and kind of a signature sound. Everything is kind of focused up front, and it's almost like a wall of sound compared to listening with all that separation and a two-channel stereo situation. It's a different experience. It's hard to explain, but if you have a receiver that has a mono switch, obviously you want to do that. You want to switch over to mono. And I find it really, really interesting listening to this album as it was, you can make the argument, as it was intended to be heard originally in its mono form. And I find it deeply, deeply satisfying. I will switch back and forth, as I have in the last week or so, between the MoFi and this original mono. And I can tell you right now, I don't have a favorite yet. I enjoy both of these listening experiences, but I will say that this original pressing in, let's call it near mint condition, is just an amazing listen. And the whole package, knowing that this thing has barely been played, just from looking at the condition of the record, it makes you wonder, because that sleeve does have some wear and tear on it. This person must have been very meticulous as far as taking care of his records. And I did find out, because I pulled 2 or 3 other records that day while I was shopping in this shop. I did find out that they had an older gentleman who was moving overseas and wanted to just basically unload his entire collection. Everything that he dropped off was in just tip-top condition, just incredible. And I actually have 2 other albums that came from that collection that will be forming, content for this series as we move forward, featuring some other iconic albums. But anyway, Blonde on Blonde, the original mono mix, an early pressing from 1966. Absolutely incredible. Some notes on the recording of Blonde on Blonde. Dylan in late 1965 was going to be, his manager Albert Grossman was in the process of booking a world tour for Dylan, and he was trying to assemble a backing band. He eventually settled on the Hawks. They did a couple dates in Toronto as a warm up, and I think they did their first date as a band in Austin, Texas, and it went well. And Grossman basically had the green light to go ahead and book a world tour, which would be, really, really well documented. And so anyway, Dylan was working on some songs and did some recording with the Hawks in late 1965 at Columbia Recording Studios in New York. Eventually, in late January, they were happy with just one track that they had laid down that eventually made its way onto Blonde on Blonde. That was One of Us Must Know, Sooner or Later. I think it's the 4th song on the album. But Bob Johnston, Dylan's producer at the time, who had been at the helm for Highway 61 as well, he had actually been suggesting to Dylan, hey, why don't we go down to Nashville? It's such a pool of talent down there, and they're just serious pros, and they have great chops. Some of the best players in America at that time were in Nashville. There were, in 1966, there were 30 different recording studios in Nashville, pumping out hits and classics left, right, and center. And Dylan decided to take Johnston up on the idea, and they ended up doing 2 different sessions, one in February and one in March of 1966. Some of the players, Charlie McCoy on guitar. Now, Charlie McCoy was also on Highway 61. He laid down an amazing acoustic track, backing track on Desolation Row. So he was already kind of in the mix and in at top of mind as far as Bob Johnson's ideas on who to bring in on these sessions for Blonde on Blonde. Now, Al Cooper and Robbie Robertson were going to be complimenting whoever else was going to be in the mix. And the other people that were in the mix, in addition to Charlie McCoy on guitar, there was Wayne Moss on guitar, famous session player as well. Joe South, who later, kind of went into his own career, also on guitar. The great Kenny Buttrey on drums. And another fantastic player was Hargus Pig Robbins on piano. Hargus Pig Robbins recently passed away. A legendary piano player, played on tons and tons and tons of albums. Willie Nelson, Waylon, tons of other stuff. He actually had a couple solo albums as well. But that guy was such a cool character. That's Hargus Pig Robbins on piano.
Middle 60s, I guess, and that was totally different from anything I'd ever done before, because we'd always been structured to be there, 2 o'clock, and we'd be ready to start playing, and we'd get 3 or 4 country songs or whatever, and they booked Bob Dylan at 6 and 10, and he might not show up till 10 o'clock, and he'd say, well, boys, I got to write a song. And so he'd want everybody to get out of the studio, and we'd roam the halls till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then he'd say, all right, I got one.
No kidding.
Yeah, it was wild. And then some of the songs would run 7 or 8 minutes, oh my God, I had never experienced anything like that. So it was really, really different.
So you read about the sessions, and it's really interesting because these session players, these Nashville cats, were used to knocking out, recordings and singles and songs in, that were between 2.5 minutes to 3 minutes long. And here comes Bob Dylan down, and they're working on Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, which is, takes up an entire side of Blonde on Blonde. There's great stories out there about just the reaction of these players, going through some of these songs. And a lot of these songs, Dylan would hang out in his hotel room, and Al Cooper would be there with him. And once Dylan was ready with a song, they would come up with some arrangements. Al Cooper would go back to the studio with the session guys, kind of go through the song, work up arrangements, and work on the changes. And then Dylan would come in, still working on the lyrics. Sometimes not, being in the studio until 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Eventually working on cutting a song at maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, while Dylan feverishly, fueled by Coca-Cola and chocolate bars and cigarettes, eventually kind of came up with a finished set of lyrics on his typewriter. And the session players would be playing cards or playing ping pong, basically hanging out, waiting for kind of the green light to start, recording. And Al Cooper famously said, the sound of 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning has never been captured like it was on Blonde on Blonde. Famously, the album in Nashville was recorded at the Columbia Music Studios, Studio A. That was right next door to the original Quonset hut that the Bradley brothers had constructed, and Patsy Cline and other famous recordings had taken place in the Quonset hut. But they eventually added another building, which became Studio A. Quonset hut was known as Studio B. It has recently been totally restored, and I think a university down there has purchased the studios, and it's used as kind of a working slash museum. So very, very cool that they're still doing recordings at Studio A at Columbia at Music Row in Nashville. The songs are legendary. I'm not going to talk too much about those, but of course you've got Rainy Day Women number 12 and 35. Everyone Must Get Stoned is kind of the subtitle of that song. Of course they couldn't lead off with that as a title. So we get Rainy Day Women number 12 and 35. Famously, during the recording of that song, it was 2 a.m. Dylan wanted the sound of a Salvation Army band. They needed a trombone player. One of the session guys put out a phone call to someone who showed up in the studio half an hour later with his trombone and was an integral part of the recording. The absolutely amazing Visions of Johanna, One of Us Must Know, I Want You, Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. That is shortened on the cover here, or on the inside cover is just Memphis Blues again. Another kind of a telltale sign that you have an early pressing of the album. Temporary Like Achilles, absolutely Sweet Marie. Fourth time around. I love, obviously, Five Believers. That's an interesting, you could talk about that one because obviously Five Believers is a good example when comparing the MoFi to the mono mix. On the MoFi, you've got Dylan's vocal kind of separated on the left channel, and you've got Robbie Robertson's lead guitar. It's a great song on the right channel, and a really interesting way to listen to that record and that song. Really good example of the benefits of that stereo mix and on the MoFi edition. Such an important, it needs to be in everyone's collection. And we got some good news recently. Vinyl Me Please is going to be putting out a mono mix of the album. And I think it's really cool that this album continues to be in print, whether that is, sporadically with MoFi, that is currently saying it is awaiting a repress. Who knows how many copies MoFi will do of that. But after the kind of digital debacle with MoFi, I think prices have come down a bit, and you might be able to find for not much over retail, which I think is about $94. I think it's listed at $94 right now on MoFi's website, but you might be able to find cheaper copies of that. But props to Vinyl Me Please for making a decision to put that out and license it. I think it's going to be a colored album. I can't remember what color the variant is, but I'm interested to maybe pick up a copy of that as well and see how it compares to the original mono mix. So really cool that we're getting a modern mono release of Blonde on Blonde again. Okay, there it is. This is episode 1, album 1, Best in Class, the iconic albums, Blonde on Blonde. It's an absolute must for any collection.